This is your faithful host, James, and I've got a returning special guest today, Mr. M. Don Sean. We're going to be reviewing Ozark Mountain Publishing book again today. It's the third one in the trilogy of books, the Elder Gods trilogy. Today's book is called Gardens of the Elder Gods. It's the third journal, as I say, and you can catch Don's previous two shows on Capricorn Radio on YouTube, obviously. And Don has a unique writing style. He's an engineer, as I've previously stated, and I find this engineering mindset, how to present evidence and get into some things like that is fascinating. So Don's going to give us a little bit on his background again, and we're going to recap on the Elder Gods theory that we've mentioned on the other two shows. Just a quick recap. And so without further ado, let's bring on my guest today. Hi Don, welcome back to Capricorn Radio.
Well, hello, James, and thank you again for inviting me back to your program. It's always a pleasure. I'm looking forward to our discussion today.
Wow, it's great to have you back again, Don. And, we really nailed it on the first two shows, I think, and there's such a wealth of information in your books, Don. And just for the listeners that aren't familiar, there's the trilogy of books, 1, 2, and 3, each one about 500 pages long, packed with information, packed with great theories, very fluid, and it weaves in all these threads of evidence from an ancient astronaut theory and the Elder Gods theory, as you call it. And we're going to talk about the third one today. This one's probably the most fun for me because it gets into a lot of lost civilizations, Don. But I guess before we start, for those people that haven't listened to the previous two shows, but could you give us a little recap on the Elder Gods theory, Don?
Well, I sure will, James. Basically, it's widely accepted that the Big Bang event brought forth our physical universe about 13.75 billion years ago. That ensuing cosmic creation continued its expansion process for 9 billion years before our solar system and planet Earth even formed, which only occurred about 4.7 billion years ago. The Elder Gods theory better explains Earth's past, along with humankind's emergence and development as the result of primordial contact with extraterrestrial visitors. This theory proposes that interventions by two very different groups of otherworldly beings influenced Earth's earliest evolution and humankind's ancestry. The first group emerged shortly after the Big Bang genesis, perhaps as quickly as only 2 billion years later, and eventually achieved great advancements after overcoming a difficult start and avoiding their own self-destruction. This first group consisted of different life forms from 7 dissimilar and distant home worlds within that early cosmos. All had survived the self-destructive nature that the early primordial universe had initially experienced after the Big Bang. Those 7 early alien species ultimately formed a multi-galactic coalition that assisted younger emerging worlds throughout the universe. The mission of that coalition, which was known as the Cosmic Order, was to explore outer space and seek out, educate, and guide younger emerging life forms that they would later encounter during their travels. Their intent was to eliminate any repetition of that self-destructive cycle that had initially plagued the early universe, which could result in those infant species destroying their own homeworld as well as neighboring planets. Ancient texts seem to reference those past cosmic disasters by describing prior ages, worlds, or suns and their destruction. Those founding members within this group of 7 alien benefactors eventually became known as the Ancient Ones by the infant races they encountered. After billions of years, representatives from the Ancient Ones Cosmic Order Coalition ultimately contacted our solar system, where a human-like species was first developing on a neighboring planet beyond Earth. There is simply insufficient data, James, available to confirm that planet's identity, but the best indications point to the two most likely candidates as either a Mars or Meldick. Meldick was the planet that once occupied the fifth orbit from our sun, which now contains the asteroid belt.
Sure.
With assistance from the ancient ones, that outer planet human-like species eventually produced a highly successful culture on their home world, but a later planetary blunder around 700,000 BC destroyed Meldick, creating the rocky remnants that now make up that asteroid, the asteroid belt. That event acutely altered the future of our solar system and extensively affected Mars, mainly its atmosphere, along with lesser damage to Earth. That catastrophe critically disrupted the advanced civilization of that outer planet human-like species. That required the ancient ones to establish bases on Earth's moon as well as on Mars for the few outer planet survivors. But that measure only provided temporary relief due to the damaged atmosphere of Mars that also resulted during Meldick's destruction, bringing into question their long-term viability. Perhaps as early as 500,000 BC, but certainly by 400,000 BC, the ancient ones started genetic engineering work to produce a common recombinant species that would be compatible with both Mars and Earth. They brought together DNA from descendants of the outer planet human-like survivors, along with our earthly Pithecanthropus species, which is better known as Java man, Heidelberg man, and Peking man, who were our planet's then current and latest evolutionary branch of Homo erectus. Numerous alterations were made with varying degrees of success over many centuries until one recombinant version was fully successful around 43,000 BC. Its earthly counterpart was Cro-Magnon man, while the outer planet race was a modified version of its original species. Refinements continued on the physiology of the genetically created Cro-Magnon species, which ultimately led to fully modern man, Homo sapiens sapiens, around 11,600 BC. But all that progress was dealt a setback with the Great Flood that happened around 10,500 BC, the event that also brought about the Pleistocene extinction. That extinction ended the saber-toothed tiger, the woolly mammoth, giant cave bears, mastodons, and numerous other species. After the Great Flood, the outer planet human-like beings on Mars started their own quest to reinvent their olden space travel capabilities of their ancestors to ultimately reach Earth for colonization. That effort took much longer than planned, splitting their population into two distinct camps. One group remained loyal to the ancient ones, but a dissenting group, the majority of the population, became independent from the ancient ones and functioned independently on their Martian base. The splinter group, the group loyal to the ancient ones, was then relocated to bases on Earth's moon, but were later destroyed by an attack from the dissenting group from Mars. Still later, that remaining dissenting group from their base on Mars eventually reached Earth for colonization around 5300 BC, and later became known as the Anunnaki, IgG, the angels, and other divinity, including the gods described in Earth's ancient texts and mythological tales. Their presence on our planet greatly disrupted the intended development the ancient ones had planned for Earth. The outer planet human-like colonists converted many humans into following them rather than the ancient ones, creating chaos on our planet. They ultimately started a world war and used the cosmic order mandates against the ancient ones to force them into temporary exile from our planet. With the ancient ones' temporary departure from Earth around 3150 BC, the outer planet human-like colonists then established themselves as gods and lorded over the human population, which essentially became their serfs and servants. They also demonized the ancient ones, referring to them as the elder gods, who were known in ancient texts as once being the greatest powers, but supposedly became evil and were defeated by the outer planet colonists, who became known as the younger gods and later just gods. Humankind's progress under the guidance of the ancient ones abruptly ended with their departure, and since then Earth has experienced continual wars, plagues, and disasters that have virtually prevented humanity from reaching their true potential as initially intended under the cosmic order coalition of the ancient ones. That's kind of a less than quick recap of really what the essence of the Elder Gods theory is, James.
It's beautiful, Don. It blows me away every time I get into this Elder Gods theory, because you have a thorough body of knowledge in the books. Obviously, 500-page books, and 3 of them packed with data. It's all data orientated, but it reads and it flows there, Don, as this story of our her human story on this planet. I guess the first thing to touch on is the development of us, the species here, Don, that you were just to pick that out of the Elder Gods theory, because there's major anomalies, Don, on our human evolution, if you want to call it that. Obviously, evolution is, it's not what we're taught in school, and I think we have been tampered with on many occasions and many species. But there's so many anomalies, Don. I think there's 2 major dates, like a 50,000 BC date, incredibly interesting time on our planet, in terms of, this jump in activity and brain power. And then there's also this 200,000 year date where our mitochondrial DNA doesn't add up past it, and it's complicated. Even the geneticists don't understand this stuff, Don.
Those are interesting aspects for sure, James, and I guess to even start with that concept, we have to understand that the first cell, the first thing that could roughly be called life on Earth, happened 3.7 billion years ago. And after 2 billion years, actually almost 3 billion years, about 2.7 billion years of single-cell life, we end up with the amoeba.
Yeah.
It just, you can't conceive of such a slow process, and yet within the last 96% of Earth's time, after its creation, all of a sudden, a higher species suddenly, appears in the presence of early man or certainly, humankind's ancestors with, ape men. Perhaps as early as 6 million years, only 6 million years ago, but certainly by about 4.5 million years ago, with the Australopithecine species of ape man, a very gentle, very, very prolific species, really a great species. Many different branches for the next 2.5 million years, continued on with very little change. And one could argue that natural evolution then occurred about 1.7 million years ago, with the emergence of our earliest ancestor, if you will, Homo erectus, and again their later branches, their evolution, and so forth. We ended up with their highest creature, if you will, which I referred to in the description of the Elder Gods theory as the Pithecanthropus branch, the Java man and Peking man, who really were very, very only slightly advanced from the early Australopithecine ape men. So again, we're just not seeing that much of natural evolution, natural mutation on our planet until roughly that 500,000, 400,000 BC level, when all of a sudden we get what really appears to be all but modern man. And that particular species is extremely a rare occurrence on our planet.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Very few fossils. They're known by a few of those specimens. Fontechevade man in France, perhaps one of the latest, the youngest of the species, with older being Swanscombe, Steinem man in Germany, Swanscombe man from England,
sure,
and several other species, but they just don't fit in the natural evolution that we see with all of the other species on Earth. They're just all of a sudden an overnight abrupt occurrence. And the closest thing we have to natural evolution after the Pithecanthropus branch, James,
mm-hmm.
is really Neanderthal man. And Neanderthals first appeared about 150,000 years ago in very sparse numbers, and they very candidly appear to be just a natural evolution from Pithecanthropus man, Peking man, if you will, that died out somewhat earlier, around 375,000 BC. So, it would be what would be expected. And unfortunately, the proto-sapiens, that almost modern man type specimen, the Steinem man and so forth that we just referred to,
sure.
They unfortunately also died out after roughly 250,000 years. And we were left with kind of a vacuum with the tail end, if you will, of Neanderthal men running around, perhaps into the late 20,000 BC time frame. I point out an example that from memory, it's about 26,000 BC as the absolute oldest, or I guess one would say the youngest, most recent specimen of Neanderthal man. So roughly they died out between 30,000 and 26,000 BC.
Mm-hmm.
Just shortly after, if you will, the again rather sudden appearance of Cro-Magnon man around 43,000 BC.
Mm-hmm.
Although there are indications, James, of earlier perhaps branches or in my estimation trial runs or experimental versions, if you will, of Cro-Magnon man going back to perhaps even 100,000 BC or 110,000 BC.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But, and then the refinements on Cro-Magnon making truly modern man, or us, as we are known today, happening by about 11,600 BC.
It's fascinating, though. I'm just thinking back to Walter Crick here and, his theory that, DNA or, some sort of genetic material might have come in on an asteroid. That this migrating through the galaxy or whatever, that this complexity of the DNA molecule might have come from somewhere else, hijacking a lift on an asteroid. He theorized this, but this does not explain what we're talking about here, Don, because what we're talking about here is very specific cases of anthropological mysteries that just cannot be explained by one chance event of a DNA molecule coming in on an ancient asteroid.
That is exactly right, James. It just doesn't really have a good explanation.
Not to rule that out in any way. I really like that theory. It may explain why some genetic material got here, but we do have so many cases, like we're talking about, Don, of the various strains of the human genome, from there's hominin X, there's the hobbit creature, there's like Neanderthals, you know, Cro-Magnons, you know, all these different types of species, these all seems to have evidence of, you know, either being interfered with, and you know what, you don't have to be a geneticist to get into the nitty gritty of the DNA molecule. Yes, to use the computers and crack the codes and use the sophisticated equipment, you would need to be a geneticist. But in terms of how it's transmitted to the public, a lot of the public, the general public, can soak this information up. It's not, you know, it's the DNA molecule is pretty well understood by the general public these days, and Genome Project and all that.
Exactly.
You know, but it's such a wild area of research because there's so many anomalies, and I find anthropology is just lacking in its investigation, Don.
Well, it's anthropology on its own is an observational science to some degree, a little less than archaeology, but still somewhat dependent upon observation. And I think that's where we get into so many problems with anthropology as well as archaeology, where specimens are forced to fit with the current orthodox belief system that has been put out. If you will, Darwinism, evolution. It's a slow and steady process, and hence dates are fudged often, and again forced to fit in you know, putting a round peg in a square hole, so to speak, and it really distorts you know, how the true history of how humankind evolved, James. And
I think we spoke before, Don, about Michael Cremo. You know, I love Michael Cremo's work. He's a tenacious, dedicated researcher. I think this would tie in a lot of Michael's work. And I think the beauty of what Michael has shown is that there's so many anomalies out there, more than we even dreamed of. And he's upturned a lot of this in academic style research books. I mean, one of his books, I think, is 900 pages long. It's a monster. It's well annotated with references, and I welcome people for that. But yeah, I mean, there's so many cases of this, Don, you know, where we really don't have a clue about anthropology examples of, you know, in most cases, some of the evidence is just lacking, just not there at all.
Well, actually, a lot of the evidence actually contradicts
theories,
again, the orthodox theory put out by anthropologists as far as humanity's development.
I can see why the orthodox theory is there. I can see why, quote, it was invented or created. It's like, well, you know, it looks like a simpler option, like, you know, that we evolved from these single-cell organisms over long periods of time. I get it why it's there. I get it. It's simple. Yeah, you know, doesn't need an external influence. It all happened here naturally on its own. But the case is that the evidence doesn't match the data. It doesn't match that. You know, it's just not there. It's a theory, and the theory is not only lacking but wrong in most cases. I think that's what we're trying to show here.
I do, boy, I fully agree with that. You really, when you get into evolution, you're talking Darwinism, and the concept of the natural evolution of species relies on Darwin's collection of many different specimens from his many expeditions, and you know, which originated then that natural evolution theory, which scientists seem to have married to a degree where, my gosh, we've so committed to this particular theory, we have to make everything that we find fit in neatly to this theory. And even by Darwin's own words, he has proven, Darwin himself has proven his theory wrong with several of his statements. I recall one where he claimed that any sudden appearance of different species would present a fatal contradiction to his belief of I believe he called it transmutation rather than, you know, pure evolution. he stated basically if numerous species all belong to the same genre, that would come into existence at the same time, then that event would be a fatal flaw to his theory of natural evolution. And we just talked about Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon existing at the same time, two species that supposedly have the same ancestral origin, which I don't think that they do, but existing at the same time, it would be a fatal flaw. The same thing with what I refer to as proto-sapiens, the Swanscombe man, Steinem man specimens, that they also existed at the same time as both Pithecanthropus as well as Neanderthal. And again, another fatal flaw to his theory.
Darwin actually he had issues with his own theory, but he was in a race to publish his work, The Origin of Species. He admitted that. It's commonly documented that he was not happy with his own theory, but because somebody else had wind of the same material and the same idea that he was in a race to publish it, he wasn't confident with it. He actually wasn't confident. It was so lacking on many levels. Some examples we're talking about.
That's an excellent point, James. He was in a race. As a matter of fact, there are a lot of people that do subscribe to the natural evolution of species that actually credit that competitor of his, Alfred Wallace.
Yeah, Alfred Wallace.
As actually coming up with the concept, and it was basically, like you say, a race. Who was going to be the first to publish the findings? They would kind of get the credit.
Yeah.
And like you say, it was Darwin then that actually threw together the theory and beat Wallace with the publication. And it does contain, like you say, James, many flaws that are fairly easy to pick out and
I was watching, since we last spoke, Don, I've been doing a bit of research. I had got into some stuff on the Neanderthals, and I watched an awesome documentary on these guys. And the Neanderthals, for me, are one of the most fascinating human strains that we've had on this planet. These guys were most likely really social and also music orientated. There's evidence to show that they had a music knowledge, able to sing to each other, and they were musically orientated. Incredibly fascinating on the Neanderthals.
You're talking about the Neanderthals.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, do you recall that if these were one of the problems with the term Neanderthal, James, is that modern anthropologists lump all species, early species after Pithecanthropus as Neanderthals.
Yeah.
And some have distinguished between the advanced early stages after Pithecanthropus, which I refer to as that sudden appearance of almost modern man as proto-sapiens, and anthropologists refer to that early appearance as early Neanderthals. So there sometimes there's a lot of confusion about the abilities of Neanderthal, which I personally think were barely, if at all, at or above the level of Pithecanthropus.
Actually, there was a bone found relatively recently in Spain, and they classified it as human, then they classified it as Neanderthal, and then they realized it's actually not even in the mainstream Neanderthal branch. So we don't even know if it's another human strain or not. This is relatively recent in the last 2 years. I think Michael was on the show talking about that.
That's a good lead. I will delve into that.
I think it was 40,000-year-old bone or something like that. Something strange. It was anomalous anyway. But I think Michael cleared up on some of the research, Michael Cremo, that it was in the region of Neanderthal, but not quite Neanderthal. Still strange nonetheless, and it's in a cave somewhere in Spain, and it was unprecedented in its time because it wasn't expected to be there. But yeah, you know, people are anthropologists. You know, not to bash them, but you know, they are scratching the surface, and they're. It's like Egyptology or certain other professions. You know, it's 70% fact and 30% theorized, finishing off the data that they don't have. It seems strange that we still do that as a species, Don. You know, but it is a major part of the story that we're talking about here for the elder gods theory. That's why I wanted to give it a good kind of precursor to what we're going to talk about. However, Don, I want to get into lost civilizations. This is my favorite. I was just talking before the show about Atlantis and why I like to research Atlantis. And you know, I love to explore truth, Don. I love to know, is there an Atlantis? I call myself an Atlantis hunter, a secret Atlantis hunter. However, I'm talking about all sorts of lost civilizations, Don, and it appeals to me that we may have lost knowledge and lost science and lost engineering. That's what I do, Don, as you know, engineering and science. But in reading the book, Don, I was recapping on stuff and a lot of the stuff I'm familiar with, but I was looking at the Arctic and the Antarctic and the Gobi Desert as regions for lost civilizations that I wasn't previously aware of. So I'm still learning, brother. But let's get into some lost civilizations, Don, on kind of in a general sense, and some really anomalous stuff.
Well, you kind of kicked it off with Atlantis, as a matter of fact, James, and I do not have a popular or well-received belief about Atlantis.
Mm-hmm.
I do believe Atlantis existed.
Yeah.
But unlike, I think, most Atlantean followers would like to think of as Atlantis itself. To me, it was a generic name for the training centers that were located all around the planet. Those were used by the ancient ones to educate and teach, civilize, I guess would be the best way of saying it. First civilize, and then teach the feral humans that that existed on our planet. So these locations I'd like to think of as Atlantis functions, or in other words, so I have read tons and tons of books about Atlantis. I find the subject just fascinating as all get out also. Mm-hmm. And I agree with every author who swears up and down that they have found Atlantis. And I agree with every one of them. They found Atlantis in the Azores, the Bahamas, Santorini, the Canary Islands, you name it, and I agree with every one of them.
They're all colonies, Don.
Well, it went beyond colonies even. These were merely isolated areas.
Yeah.
Hence they weren't disrupted or interrupted by wild beasts and other feral humans that might attack, and it was a safe place to be able to take very select groups of humans from the wild, if you will, and into this learning academy, this place called Atlantis, and civilize and teach humanity. Genetic engineering or not, you're going to have a test subject or a trial run of test subjects and release them into the wild to see how they react with the environment. Do they survive on their own? Otherwise, you haven't really accomplished your goal or mission by making a recombinant species capable of surviving on their own on a dual planet or dual habitable environmental basis. So they did not teach the lab specimens, if you will,
Gotcha.
before they were released, because it was a trial. and they wanted to see how they would react with the climate, the environment, etc. So once they had an actual species, the ancient ones actually had a human species that they could work with and civilize. They then had to go out and gather them up, and at least in small groups again, and bring them to a safe location away from the feral environment that existed, and civilize and teach them to once again release them back, to their own people, who then became the teachers of their own brethren, their own natives of their tribe or their clan or whatever. Mm-hmm. So, Atlantis was certainly a highly achieved cultural area, but I don't think it was a civilization per se. I think it was a training center.
I gotcha.
And it was also, if you will, the headquarters of some of the ancient ones, but mostly of their helpers, the assistants of previous infant race aliens that they had encountered over the years and on different planets in different solar systems and different galaxies, and they went from a feral type species to a highly advanced culture, civilization, more than likely vastly beyond 21st century Earth even. And graduates of those developed planets, if you will, planets developed by the ancient ones, that they would encounter at random in the throughout the cosmos, they would select the highest representatives of those races, of those infant races, to become their helpers, to assist them in their continuing mission of the cosmic order, to reach more infant races and to educate and civilize them, and et cetera, and et cetera. It just went on and on and on. It a domino effect, a snowball effect. So,
it's fascinating. It's
like I say, it's not a popular opinion that I have on Atlantis, but I have even less popular opinion on Mu and Lemuria.
No, not at all, Don. You know what? It's actually a sobering perspective you have on it, because dare you step outside the norm to give a different opinion of Atlantis? You're crucified for it. You've got two camps: the ones that treat you like with disdain for looking into Atlantis, and then the people that are this mainstream idea of Atlantis, and they find it as this sunken, lost continent, and that's it. And they seem to concentrate on this one facet of this culture, civilization, or, like you say, training centers. So. It's a good perspective on it, Don, and it's a sobering perspective.
One of the aspects that perhaps led me to my interpretation of Atlantis, and Mu and Lemuria and so forth, James, has been my study of late 19th century, very, very, very early 20th century books on Atlantis, by researchers at the time. I was enamored with their research. 1880s to 1920s. A phenomenal amount of global research was going on by very competent investigative researchers and fortunately authors, at the time. And one thing that always struck me as odd, they always forced, much like the anthropologists and archaeologists, they forced their findings to fit with the theory of a long lost civilization known as Atlantis. And all of they had very good, solid research that they did, and the evidence that they uncovered to me, shouted of ancient aliens, not a lost human race.
Yeah.
And since at the time there was no one back at that time that seemed to conceive of ancient aliens that could have utilized such places as Atlantis, wherever it may have been, and hence they forced their findings to be this fictitious. We know it had to have existed. We know some lost civilization, human civilization, had to have existed in the far distant remote past because of all of the evidence we find. And hence it shaped. I think it shaped generation after generation after generation of readers that, of course, there was an ancient, remote, lost human civilization that had reached a very high level of civilized culture. And I don't think I personally don't think that was the case, that it was the alien influence that created those long lost learning center locations that we like to think of as Atlantis.
Wow. Fascinating. Fascinating.
Doesn't make it right, because I think that, but that was one reason why I came to the conclusion that I did, that it was Atlantis referred more to a function than a specific culture or civilization.
I like the way you think, Don, and similar to myself, I look at the convoluted complexity of the data that's out there from all the variety sources that we're talking about in your other two books and this one, and from the hard evidence of ancient cultures, ancient sites, records of ancient cultures and what they say, and matching up with some evidence too, and it's vast, and there's commonalities all across, and all these mysterious anomalies, and the thing that I get is, like, you have to reverse engineer the data to come up with a theory, instead of what mainstream does is they have a theory and then they explain away the data, and I do what you do, Don. I look at it from a reverse engineering process. That's the engineer in me, and like I said before the show, there's a host of engineers on the case now. Not that it's the only skill set that should be writing books, by all means. We need a diverse group of people out there to be researching this subject matter, and from all backgrounds, because everybody has I usually find that somebody from outside the norm has a unique perspective on it and sees data in a different way. But like I said, Don, there's a reverse engineering of the data, and I can see exactly why you think that, because it makes sense. It seems more natural to think like that than it does to anything we've alluded to. I think one thing I mentioned with the Gobi Desert was, Don, that this ancient sea that was there, probably 70,000 BC, and there was a place there called White Island, and the ancient records talk about these masters or the divine beings there, in our physical domain. I just find this fascinating. I think China also talks about these shining ones, these tall people that were shining. They had a shine off them, they referred to them as the shining ones. And perhaps this is the Elohim that we're talking about. We've had another author on talking about that in China as well. And this is what I love about your work, Don. I'm finding data that you have well researched and I wasn't aware of, but I have covered on other subject matter on.
Well, White Island was I'm searching my memory, which isn't as good as it once was, James, unfortunately. Sure. And but it was I do recall it as an extremely fascinating place, and it was the perfect Atlantean type structure once again, where it was an approachable top of the mountain. In other mythical accounts of White Island, it was an island in the sky. Sure. Now, it may have been an island in the sky at the top of a mountain, and it appeared to be in the sky because, low-lying clouds or whatever, and then you see something above the clouds. But other accounts, mythological accounts, also included a golden spaceship, a mothership, if you will, of immense size that was associated with that celestial culture of White Island.
Wow.
And that was the Chinese had records of such a grand high civilization, that was unapproachable but friendly, never attacked or anything of that nature. And even there were some very rare Russian myths, I guess would be the best way of saying it, olden tales, that also seem to indicate the same type of celestial city like White Island. And again, also associated with a great sea or ocean that over time had diminished to a lake, and then finally evaporated and became a desert, and hence that's where we have the Gobi Desert and other desert areas within China, Mongolia, and so forth. But again, to me, it was just another training location, a functional Atlantis, a site that performed the Atlantis function, as I refer to it.
I think, Don, you'll agree, the more you look, the more you find. And I find a lot of authors, Don, this is where you're different, is a lot of authors will concentrate on, the hot spots, Egypt and, Cairo, and they'll go to Mesoamerica and Tiwanaku and pyramids over there, and, they go to the Olmecs, and they concentrate on these main known about subjects, but very few step outside and go to the remote regions and look for stuff. And it's all throughout your book, Don. You're tying in threads of evidence time and time again. I'll say, Don, 1,500 pages. There's no filler material in this. It's just all. It's like I'm waiting for the filler material, and there's no filler material. You have 1,500 pages of raw data, and filling this story from start to finish. And it's like this took you some amount of time to do, Don.
Well, thank you so much for those kind words, James. And in particular, the third volume, Gardens of the Elder Gods, I didn't want to have this hodgepodge or hit and miss aspect of major civilizations, concentrating on the Maya in the Americas, Egypt in the Near East, perhaps China, or certainly India, with their vast ancient records going back to some unknown or not truly defined ancient high culture mentioned throughout many Sanskrit records. I approached it from the standpoint, if indeed the Elder Gods theory is correct, then there would be an Atlantis function in every area of the world.
The globe, yeah.
And that's actually how the book Gardens of the Elder Gods, and it's plural, gardens. It's not one garden. It's gardens of the Elder Gods, where all of the Atlantis functions, if you will, took place. And for that reason, it really did require getting into some of the weeds, if you will,
sure,
of cultures that there had to have been something here, as an ancient teaching facility to allow the human natives at the time to be able to build these grand structures and so forth. We read a lot in our current news about the Arabian Peninsula in particular, and Yemen, specifically, and we think of purely a desert area and no culture, at the time, Egypt was the highest thing going, highest culture going, and yet Yemen has some of the greatest achievements. The Marib Dam, perhaps going back to 5000 BC, really before the Egyptians. Constructions that not quite as grand in scope, certainly as the pyramids, but on a somewhat smaller but equally impressive engineering basis.
Wow, Don, fascinating. Don, did you ever get into any serious research into the Chinese pyramids? And did you come up with anything interesting? It's very hard to get information on them, I think.
I did not. I heard rumors, vague references in some of the books that I read and researched, but I could never come up with anything concrete to the point where it would be enough to fill a page or two in solid data that I would be comfortable in printing.
Very hard to get material on Google Earth, I think.
Now the Japanese pyramids, the Yanaguchi, I'm
Yonaguni, yeah, the underwater.
Yonaguni, thank you. Yes, those pyramids. Well, again, Dr. Schock did a lot of research on the Yonaguni site, and so we have these anomalies. This is not something that people think of for Japan. The Egyptian type pyramids in Japan, especially submerged pyramids.
I think there's even a face down there as well. There seems to be what looks like a carved face. Now there's actually been several dive teams gone back down since that, Don. There was an English crew went down. An American crew went down, I think, and a lot of documentaries, independent, all filling a 1 hour documentary. But there's been several people back down since that, Don, and there's still more anomalies coming out of there. Yeah.
Well, we have so many undiscovered sites yet. I'm just positive that exist, and hints of those that have not been fully explored. Such as the 2,000 foot depth off the northern tip of Cuba.
Oh yeah.
And boy, there's a lot of back and forth controversy on that find, but that appeared to be just another one of these unbelievable. It would be impossible for a culture to have built it, and yet it's there.
Yeah. I think there was a Russian team with the Cuban went found diving in 2001, and it seemed to be silenced after that, and not much came out for further research. But yeah, it's at such a depth down there, it's submergence. But kind of that brings us into cataclysms, Don. I'm going to take a little break, and we're going to get into cataclysms, Don, straight after it with the Cuban pyramid being so far down, and the Yonaguni monument as well is a good starting point after the break. Welcome back, everybody. You're listening to Capricorn Radio. This is your host, James, and we're talking to today's author, Mr. Don Shorn. You can catch Don at Ozark Mountain Publishing website. You can catch Don's trilogy of books there, the Elder Gods trilogy. Today we're talking about Gardens of the Elder Gods, and fascinating discussion we're having. And Don, you with me?
I sure am, James.
Hey, Don, we were talking just before the break about Earth cataclysms. We were talking about Cuba and the sunken pyramid there, and the Yonaguni monument in Japan. Of course, there's sunken monuments all across the globe, from India. Many examples, Don, showing some sort of structures underneath the water. I actually learned there was a Stonehenge type structure in one of the Great Lakes as well. Are you aware of that one, Don?
I was not.
I only came across that one last year. There's so much of this stuff happening. Maybe the Great Lakes was filled in or something like that. But yeah, there is. Divers have been down for that one. But yeah, all across the globe, Don, even off the coast of Scotland, there's a stone circle that's submerged, only maybe 10 meters, so we know there was rising sea levels, and but there's like we alluded to at Cube and stuff, that sometimes these sea levels are so the structures are so deep down to sea that the last time that they were above water was like deep epochs, deep periods of time, and it's hinting at cataclysms, and that's one. But there's many types of cataclysms. There's I think Hancock's proposing this comet as the one that melted the ice caps now. I think he's really going with that. But it seems to be a lot of ancient cultures have this cataclysmic event going on in their mythology, Don.
Now, when you're talking about the melting of the ice caps, after the or in conjunction with the Great Flood, the 10,500 BC time frame.
Sure.
They're very, very solid scientific proof out now, James, with a layer of what are called nanodiamonds.
Wow.
That all but prove that a comet was one of the elements. It may not have been the sole cause of the Great Flood and the Pleistocene extinction that resulted thereafter, but it was certainly a major contributing factor. And that's about all I can recall on that right now. I'm doing a fourth book in the series, and that was part of the new research, and that's in the first part of the book, and I started that about 3 years ago, and my memory again is not as good as it once was, but I do recall that there's pretty
hard evidence,
good solid geological data and proof now that that a comet was involved. Perhaps as early as 500,000 BC, but certainly by 400,000 BC, the ancient ones started genetic engineering work to produce a common recombinant species that would be compatible with both Mars and Earth. They brought together DNA from descendants of the outer planet human-like survivors, along with our earthly Pithecanthropus species, which is better known as Java man, Heidelberg man, and Peking man, who were our planet's then current and latest evolutionary branch of Homo erectus.
Mm-hmm.
Numerous alterations were made with varying degrees of success over many centuries until one recombinant version was fully successful around 43,000 BC.
Mm-hmm.
Its earthly counterpart was Cro-Magnon man, while the outer planet race was a modified version of its original species. Refinements continued on the physiology of the genetically created Cro-Magnon species, which ultimately led to fully modern man, Homo sapiens sapiens, around 11,600 BC. But all that progress was dealt a setback with the Great Flood that happened around 10,500 BC, the event that also brought about the Pleistocene extinction. That extinction ended the saber-toothed tiger, the woolly mammoth, giant cave bears, mastodons, and numerous other species. After the Great Flood, the outer planet human-like beings on Mars started their own quest to reinvent their olden space travel capabilities of their ancestors to ultimately reach Earth for colonization. That effort took much longer than planned, splitting their population into two distinct camps. One group remained loyal to the ancient ones, but a dissenting group, the majority of the population, became independent from the ancient ones and functioned independently on their Martian base.
But could you give us a little recap on the Elder Gods theory, Don?
Well, I sure will, James. Basically, it's widely accepted that the Big Bang event brought forth our physical universe about 13.75 billion years ago. That ensuing cosmic creation continued its expansion process for 9 billion years before our solar system and planet Earth even formed, which only occurred about 4.7 billion years ago. The Elder Gods theory better explains Earth's past, along with humankind's emergence and development as the result of primordial contact with extraterrestrial visitors. This theory proposes that interventions by two very different groups of otherworldly beings influenced Earth's earliest evolution and humankind's ancestry. The first group emerged shortly after the Big Bang Genesis, perhaps as quickly as only 2 billion years later, and eventually achieved great advancements after overcoming a difficult start and avoiding their own self-destruction. This first group consisted of different life forms from 7 dissimilar and distant home worlds within that early cosmos. All had survived the self-destructive nature that the early primordial universe had initially experienced after the Big Bang. Those 7 early alien species ultimately formed a multi-galactic coalition that assisted younger emerging worlds throughout the universe. The mission of that coalition, which was known as the Cosmic Order, was to explore outer space and seek out, educate, and guide younger emerging life forms that they would later encounter during their travels. Their intent was to eliminate any repetition of that self-destructive cycle that had initially plagued the early universe, which could result in those infant species destroying their own home world as well as neighboring planets. Ancient texts seem to reference those past cosmic disasters by describing prior ages, worlds, or suns and their destruction. Those founding members within this group of 7 alien benefactors eventually became known as the Ancient Ones by the infant races they encountered. After billions of years, representatives from the Ancient Ones Cosmic Order Coalition ultimately contacted our solar system, where a human-like species was first developing on a neighboring planet beyond Earth. There is simply insufficient data, James, available to confirm that planet's identity, but the best indications point to the 2 most likely candidates as either Mars or Maldek. Maldek was the planet that once occupied the 5th orbit from our sun, which now contains the asteroid belt.
Sure.
With assistance from the Ancient Ones, that outer planet human-like species eventually produced a highly successful culture on their home world, but a later planetary blunder around 700,000 BC destroyed Maldek, creating the rocky remnants that now make up that asteroid, the asteroid belt. That event acutely altered the future of our solar system and extensively affected Mars, mainly its atmosphere, along with lesser damage to Earth. That catastrophe critically disrupted the advanced civilization of that outer planet human-like species. That required the Ancient Ones to establish bases on Earth's moon as well as on Mars for the few outer planet survivors. But that measure only provided temporary relief due to the damaged atmosphere of Mars that also resulted during Maldek's destruction, bringing into question their long-term viability.
This is your faithful host, James, and I've got a returning special guest today, Mr. M. Don Sean. We're going to be reviewing Ozark Mountain Publishing book again today. It's the 3rd one in the trilogy of books, the Elder Gods trilogy. Today's book is called Gardens of the Elder Gods. It's the 3rd journal, as I say, and You can catch Dawn's previous 2 shows on Capricorn Radio on YouTube, obviously. And Dawn has a unique writing style. He's an engineer, as I've previously stated, and I find this engineering mindset, how to present evidence and get into some things like that is fascinating. So Don's going to give us a little bit on his background again, and we're going to recap on the Elder Gods theory that we've mentioned on the other 2 shows. Just a quick recap. And so without further ado, let's bring on my guest today. Hi Don, welcome back to Capricorn Radio.
Well, hello, James, and thank you again for inviting me back to your program. It's always a pleasure. I'm looking forward to our discussion today.
Wow, it's great to have you back again, Don. And, we really nailed it on the first 2 shows, I think, and there's such a wealth of information in your books, Don. And just for the listeners that aren't familiar, there's the trilogy of books, 1, 2, and 3, each one about 500 pages long, packed with information, packed with great theories, very fluid, and it weaves in all these threads of evidence from an ancient astronaut theory and the Elder Gods theory, as you call it. And we're going to talk about the 3rd one today. This one's probably the most fun for me because it gets into a lot of lost civilizations, Don. But I guess before we start, for those people that haven't listened to the previous 2 shows,
the splinter group, the group loyal to the Ancient Ones, was then relocated to bases on Earth's moon, but were later destroyed by an attack from the dissenting group from Mars. Still later, that remaining dissenting group from their base on Mars eventually reached Earth for colonization around 5300 BC, and later became known as the Anunnaki, IgG, the angels, and other divinity, including the gods described in Earth's ancient texts and mythological tales. Their presence on our planet greatly disrupted the intended development the Ancient Ones had planned for Earth. The outer planet human-like colonists converted many humans into following them rather than the Ancient Ones, creating chaos on our planet. They ultimately started a world war and used the cosmic order mandates against the Ancient Ones to force them into temporary exile from our planet. With the Ancient Ones' temporary departure from Earth around 3150 BC, the outer planet human-like colonists then established themselves as gods and lorded over the human population, which essentially became their serfs and servants. They also demonized the Ancient Ones, referring to them as the Elder Gods, who were known in ancient texts as once being the greatest powers, but supposedly became evil and were defeated by the outer planet colonists, who became known as the Younger Gods and later just gods. Humankind's progress under the guidance of the Ancient Ones abruptly ended with their departure, and since then Earth has experienced continual wars, plagues, and disasters that have virtually prevented humanity from reaching their true potential as initially intended under the Cosmic Order Coalition of the Ancient Ones. That's kind of a less than quick recap